Stories from Real Life is an independent podcast that is written and produced by Melvin E. Edwards. You can get details about each episode or contribute to the future success of this show by visiting the website at www.podcastreallife.com.
On today's edition of Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards, our guest is Jack Kammer, a social worker and advocate for gender diversity in social services. From 1983 to 1989, he hosted In a Man's Shoes, a weekly radio talk show in Baltimore. Discussions of gender bias in social services by the show's guests and callers led him to enroll in a dual social work business administration master's degree program at the University of Maryland, which he completed in 2008. Kammer worked for a year as a correctional officer at the infamous Baltimore City Jail, a year as a parole and probation officer in central Baltimore, and a year as a trainer and consultant with the National Fatherhood Initiative. He has presented workshops on anti-male bias at 7 state and national social work conferences. Let's join today's guest, Jack Kammer, and your host, Melvin E. Edwards.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to this episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me on this week's learning adventure. As you heard in the intro, our guest is former Baltimore social worker Jack Kammer. Hi, Jack. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Melvin. Thanks for having me. It's going to be fun.
Yes, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So my first question today is the most obvious one. Is Jack Kammer your real name?
We all have our crosses to bear. My legal name is John, but I've always been Jack. The only time I am John Kammer is when I'm in trouble. I didn't even know it was a funny name until high school. And then my high school buddies, of course, would razz me about Jack Kammer, Jack Kammer, because that's what high school friends are for, right? So that is my real name, although it's not my legal name.
Okay, that makes total sense. Okay, so we'll just call you Jack. We'll just leave it at that.
That's good. Yeah.
All right. So
my friends call me pneumatic street repair device. If you want to.
That's a little bit difficult to pronounce, so we'll just say Jack.
Okay.
All right. So starting this conversation, we're going to talk about men's issues, mostly male issues, yes. boys and men. So one thing I want to clarify is to start this: the term sex and gender used to be used interchangeably, but it's not necessarily the case anymore. So I think it's important to clarify how we use them so that we're on the same page with the listeners who are listening to this discussion. So can you tell me how you will use those terms today?
Well, actually, I am guilty of sort of conflating the two. But technically, sex is the biological fact. Although, that fact is under some adjustment now with, the idea of intersex. But sex is about biology, whereas gender is about social expectations.
All right. So you also had the opportunity to work with the late Maryland Congressman Elijah Cummings.
Yes.
And the bill you worked with him on was labeled the wimp bill.
Yes.
So can you tell me about that?
Yes, I can. Oh, it's a little painful, but yes, I can. So on my radio show, I had a fellow as a guest named Richard Rowe, who worked for the Baltimore Urban League. He's a black fellow. Also brilliant fellow. He was doing a conference at an HBCU, Morgan University. I think it was Morgan State University back then. He was doing a conference at Morgan State University on black men and endangered species. Now, that's a phrase that, you've heard probably. But back in 84, I think it probably was, 85, that was a really new concept. So when I heard about this conference, I invited Richard right away to please be on my show. I mean, it's about, his conference was about Black men. He was going to talk about the blackness of the Black men and the maleness of the Black man. And the 1-2 double whammy, 1-2 punch that Black men get. They're no good because they're Black, and they're no good because they're male. We really hit it off. We saw eye to eye on a lot of things, and I really liked them. And we thought, isn't it a shame that it's so hard to get anybody to listen to what's really going on by virtue of the fact that half the population is male? And men have problems by virtue of being male, and nobody wants to hear it. So we thought, look, the state of Maryland is dealing extensively and spending tons of money on lots of problems that are directly connected to what you could call sexism against men, biases against men, unfair expectations of men, pressures on men, 19 times as many men in jail as women, proportional to the population. And so we thought we could go to Annapolis, the capital of Maryland, and talk to the legislators about establishing a commission for men to go along with the commission for women. My personal belief is that the most sexist idea of all is the idea that only women are ever harmed by sexism and only men are ever sexist. Men are also harmed by sexism. So Richard and I go down to Annapolis. We're a couple of, yokels. We don't know how that game is played, but we sort of kind of learned a little bit. And I had a friend, actually a friend of one of my older brothers who was a state legislator. And he agreed, although he kept his arm's distance from the bill, he said, I'll get a bill written up for you by legislative services. And he did. And it was, pretty good for first impression. And Richard and I learned that the way the game is played in Maryland, and I think in other states too, is that if you can get a sponsor for your bill by a certain deadline, you can get yourself a hearing scheduled in advance so that you have all of that advance time to get your witnesses together and put your testimony together so that when the hearing occurs, you can put on a good show. So we were struggling like crazy to try to find somebody to sponsor this thing. And the word, in the hallways, in public, from a lot of these fellas, very traditional men, that's how they got to be state legislators. They were saying things like, ha, 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 this is the wimp bill. Ha, ha, ha. If we pass this bill, I'm going to have to stop eating quiche. I don't know if young people today know it, but back in the day, there was a meme about, before memes were even memes, there weren't even memes at the time, but there was a saying that real men don't eat quiche.
Yeah, that was actually the title of a book.
Yes, it was, yes.
I've seen that.
So these fellows were sort of making jokes about, the wimp bill. Okay. So, in that context, Richard and I are looking for a sponsor. We are getting up against a deadline by which we have to have a sponsor so that we can have our advance scheduled hearing. Somebody said, why don't you go talk to Elijah? Now, Elijah represented a district in West Baltimore, pretty rough part of town. It's where The Wire was mostly about, at least in its first season. So we go to Elijah's office, and we told him what we were there for. he said, let me see it. Let me see the bill. He took a look at the bill, and it was pretty well written, made some pretty good points. And I'll never forget. He sighed. He went, because he remembers all these guys. He knows all these guys are calling it the wimp bill. He sighs. He goes, give me a pen. Can we give him a pen? And he signs it. And as he signs it, he said, just don't embarrass me. So we had 2 weeks, or maybe it was 3, to put together our testimony. We had lots of other people who were interested in social issues, progressively so, who were very supportive of what we were trying to do. And so we put on a really good hearing. And the newspaper articles about the legislative session up until that point had heard that we were trying to do this Commission on Men, and they were also poking fun at us. This is the stupidest thing in the world. Why even bother with this? The legislature's got much better things to do. They were making fun of us and trying to make us look foolish. After we put on the hearings, we got headlines like, no one is laughing at the wimp bill now. Really good hearings. Really good hearings. Now, we didn't get a positive vote. You'd never get a positive vote, the first year, second year, third year. Maybe the third year you do. We didn't get I don't even think we got out of committee. I think the committee voted it down. But Elijah told me later we had made him a superstar. Because in the Black community, there were people who thought, yeah, we need something like this because we see what's going on with our young men. This is a good idea. So I just had a ton of respect for Elijah Cummings, a ton. Because he was a leader. He wasn't a nose counter. He wasn't looking around to see who's going to, give me attaboys for this. He did the right thing. He did his duty as a legislator. He knew what his people needed, and he stood up for it. So I love Elijah Cummings.
That's great. So what difference does it make to have male issues discussed in the larger society?
Well, for one thing, it will make men happier to have somebody say, we hear you, we feel you, we understand what you're going through. We know it's craziness to say it's a man's world and men have all the power and women don't have any, and men have all the advantages and women are powerless and you get no privileges and men have all the privileges. The pressure that puts on men, to be told you've got it easy, yet many men are struggling. There's a sociological and psychological phenomenon called the apex fallacy. And so the apex fallacy causes us to think about people at the top. And so, there are a lot of men at the top of the male power structure, the Fortune 500. What we don't talk about is the misfortune 5 million. The guys on the bottom rungs of the male power structure, which is very hierarchical. People at the top are doing great. People at the bottom ain't doing so great. A lot of pressure on them. Violence, robbery, domestic violence, when guys are so stressed out they can't even, control themselves around their wives. Educational underachievement. Young men leaving school because they got to go out and make money. And how do they make money? If you come out of a rotten school system and they pass you through high school, they graduate you from high school when you can barely read, how are you going to get a good job? Especially in a depressed town like Baltimore, which had lost a lot of blue-collar jobs. A lot of jobs where a high school education would set you up for a pretty good life. So the reason it's needed to talk about male gender issues is because the old saying, garbage in, garbage out, if you plug the idea that men have no problems into your social policy machinery, you're going to get garbage out. And the garbage that comes out is that, we got to be tough on these guys, got to lock them up, got to throw away the key. When there's a problem in a marriage or in a non-marriage, but a male-female father-mother relationship, when there's a problem between the father and the mother, what do? You throw him away. He's a bum. We all know how men are. He ain't no good. And so kids lose their fathers. There's all this talk about responsible fatherhood and how fathers are absent and how fathers have abandoned their children. Yes, that happens, no doubt. I think it happens a lot. A lot of the time it happens because men are just not able to live up to the expectations of providing in a steady way for their kids, and they give up. The best thing they can do is to just sort of go away so maybe some other man can come along or the mother can get welfare. That kind of thing. Men don't not every man who leaves his wife and kids does so because he's cavalier and doesn't care. So, a lot of reasons we need to understand much better than we do what's really going on with men.
Okay, and I agree 100%. And I want to get a little personal here on this issue. And it's right there in your backyard. I lived in Maryland for 18 years, and I worked in Annapolis for 15 of those 18 years. And the other 3, I worked in Baltimore City, downtown Baltimore. So I saw a lot of the same kind of things, probably a lot of the same people you saw. But unfortunately, during the time I was in Maryland, I experienced my divorce. It was pretty traumatic. A traumatic experience. And this was 20 years ago, I saw firsthand at that point how the courts consistently assumed the mothers were the default parents and how it was so made almost intentionally so much more difficult for the fathers to stay in their children's lives. And I did so because that was my only objective. I was so determined. I didn't care what it cost. I didn't care what I had to do. I was not going to be a statistic. I was not going to allow my children to be statistics. And here's another very personal story about that time. I had 4 children who were minors during the time of my divorce. And when my oldest daughter graduated from high school, she was 17 years old. And the week she graduated, she moved in with me full time. So she lived with me that summer. And then she went away to college. She was still 17 for her first semester of college. She went to college in Florida. She turned 18 at the end of that semester. On her 18th birthday, I went to the Baltimore County system, child support system or child welfare system. I can't even remember what it's called. And I had her birth certificate. And I said, my daughter's turning 18 today. I would like my child support to end. But mind you, I was still paying child support while I was paying college tuition for the kid who had moved in with me in June. It was now November, so I was paying child support and college tuition for the same child at the same time. And on her 18th birthday, I said, here's her birth certificate. Here's my driver's license. You see the name matches. I want my child support to end for this child. I would continue to pay for the other 3. And they said, well, you've got to fill out this form and we've got to mail it to the mother so that she has to agree that this child is 18 years old. And I was there. I know she was 18 years old. And so my ex-wife just ignored it for a year. So when she was 19 years old, we finally went back to court. I had to spend thousands of dollars more for a lawyer to go to court to have her child support ended. At that point, she had been in college she was a sophomore in college. She had lived with me for 2 years. She hadn't lived with her mother. And at that time, I was still paying child support. and still paying college tuition for the same child because they wouldn't take my word and the documentation that I had that I was her father and that she was an adult at that point. So I would have a lot of men would have given up way before that. And I started to understand it at that point. Like it would have been understandable for a normal person to give up at that point.
So fatherhood problems are the primary way that the average Joe gets enlightened to the fact that there's people out there who don't really care about men, except for how much money they can provide. And this sort of, if it's all right with you, or if you want to continue talking about your personal situation, that's great. But I want to mention that, to me, fatherhood is the central issue for men, whether they are fathers or not, whether they want to be fathers or not. The reason I say that is because of all of the negative stereotypes, unjustifiable negative stereotypes about men. All of those negative, unjustifiable stereotypes about men center in one way or another to the idea that they don't really make good fathers. They don't really make good parents. I mean, think of a stereotype about men. Men are violent. Men are rude. Men are just thinking about sex all the time. They just want to get drunk. They just want to sit on the sofa and watch football. Whatever you want, whatever negative stereotype you can think of, in one way or another, demeans our ability to be recognized as a guy like you. Kind, caring, loving, nurturing, generous. All of the things you would want a parent to be. And at the same time, along with all of the negative stereotypes about men as parents, there are all of these unjustifiable positive stereotypes about women as mothers. Now, look, most men aren't perfect, but most men are great. Most women are great, but they're not perfect. But there are tons of stereotypes surrounding mothers, halos around mothers' heads. Oh, they're kind and sweet and caring and gentle and loving and nurturing and so patient, and they just give and give and give. All of that stuff, a lot of which is true, but it's not always true for all women all the time. It's sort of like equality, which is why I want to talk about this, because my main purpose in life these days is to talk about the ways in which the women's movement has let us all down. It should have been, and it actually started as a movement for real equality and comedy fairness between men and women. I'm old enough to remember it. I was born in 1951. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963. Her book was pretty freaking nice all the way around. She said a lot of things that were really hard for women to have to deal with, but she didn't blame men for everything. She talked about the gender expectations on both sides. What should have happened, and it started to happen, but then it got shut down, what should have happened was like what would happen at a company where you have two partners. And one partner says to the other partner, there's some things I don't really like about the way this is going. How are you doing on your end? What would you like? What would you like us to change if we were to change things? Because I got some changes I want to make. You probably would say, well, yeah, I've got some problems too, and maybe we could do it like this and that, and we could have a win-win. Well, what happened with the women's movement was that it started out being interested, of course, in what women wanted, and it started out being interested in what men might want, but it didn't take long. It didn't take long for the leaders of the women's movement who were trying to get other women to join, to hear some reluctance on the part of a lot of women who were hearing their husbands and boyfriends saying things like, well, I love the women's movement. It's going to be great for men too. And men started saying, back to the idea of fatherhood, yeah, I would really like to be an equal father. You want to be equal in academia? You want to be equal in the big corporate power structures? Great. Great. I'll trade you. You be equal there, and I'll be equal at home with the family and with the kids. My purpose, my reputation, my value as a parent is going to be equal to yours. And a lot of women said, well, wait a second, that's not what I signed up for when I signed up this quote-unquote women's movement, the National Organization for Women. Well, so how did the leaders of the women's movement solve that problem? How did they make it unnecessary for women to have to actually listen and bargain and negotiate and hear what gender equality would look like for men? How did they crush that? The way they crushed that was to claim that we were women's enemies. Yeah. We are their oppressors. There was a group of women in New York towards the end of the 60s. I think it was like 1969, I think, is when they issued their Red Stockings Manifesto. Women are totally oppressed. Our oppression is total. We identify men as our oppressors. Well, if you can establish that in the media and in academia and in supposedly enlightened arenas, nobody's going to say, well, you need to negotiate with your oppressor. Yeah. You don't negotiate with oppressors. You try to beat them. You try to kill them. You try to get around them. You don't engage them and say, well, what would you like? And that's what they did with men. We were made into the oppressors. I think we were like gobsmacked, like, what? Take a look at what we do. All day, every day, when we try to make money, we bring it home and we don't just spend it on ourselves. So I believe that what used to be called male bashing, were you around for that phrase? It was pretty early. A horrible spate of male bashing. It was really all about establishing us as either the oppressors of women or as clueless Neanderthals who had no business trying to be parents of kids, especially not if there's a divorce and the mother isn't around. And to me, that is the essential disease, but the essential mistake, the essential cynicism of the women's movement. And so the reason fatherhood is central for all men is because we need to justify our ability to be fathers, great parents, nurturing, loving, kind, caring, wise, gentle, patient, just as much as women needed to be accepted as equals in business. They could be astronauts. They could be soldiers. Women wanted to be recognized as equal to men in the spheres where they used to be excluded. We still today, 60 years after Betty Friedan's book, we still today are struggling to be recognized as equals of women when it comes to parenting. And we gotta fix that. That is the sweet spot. And that is the soft underbelly of the women's movement. Because the statistics are quite clear that fathers are hugely important to their kids, and that single fathers, do at least as good a job raising kids as single mothers do. Now, one of the reasons, interestingly enough, that might be true is because single fathers, much more than single mothers, want to make sure that their kids also have a relationship with the other parent. Because we recognize the value of mothers much more than women recognize the value of fathers. And that's a general statement, but it's generally true. So, the reason I'm out on the podcast tour, the podcast circuit, is because we need to bolster fatherhood. That's the place where we can fix a lot of the problems that are facing men these days. And who else is it affecting? It's affecting boys. Because you tell me that I should be a good student in school and I should work hard and I should study and I should try to get a good job and, play within the system, that I should play ball with the system. But, I look around and I don't see myself in 20 years anywhere where I want to be. I don't see any adult men. I don't see many adult men. I don't see many men being respected for what I really want to be respected for. I see them being respected for, hey, where's the money? And I don't want to be a wallet. So the hell with it. I'll go, in the worst circumstances, I'll go deal drugs. I'll make a ton of money. I'll go buy a BMW, and I'll have some girls all over me, and I'll have a wild time for a while until I either get shot or go to jail. Because because these young men do not see a solid future for themselves when fathers are dismissed so easily, tossed out so easily, who have to fight so hard just to be regarded as the equals of the kids' mothers in how much they love and care about their kids. Now, fathers and mothers might parent differently, but isn't that the whole idea of diversity? It's the way a mother is supposed to be. The way a mother would approach a problem for the kid and the way a father might approach the same problem that the kid is having might be very different. But if a mother and father respect each other, as they should, just as men are supposed to respect the women in companies, if women respected men as fathers, they'd work out some kind of a deal like, look, we'll try it your way for 2 weeks, and if that doesn't work, we'll meet again and we'll talk again, and maybe we'll come up with a different idea. Something like that, some negotiation, some partnership, some respect between the two. However, just as men were raised to believe in the 1940s, 50s, and, way back longer than that, to believe that they were better than women in math and science and making decisions and being leaders, just as that was true as a mistake that men made, it is still true today that women will voice their deepest feelings when you hear them say, well, I'm the mother, I'm the boss. Yeah. I'm not a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but I'm a CEO of a little tiny company called my family, and I'm the boss. And so what does that do to fathers? It causes some fathers to say, I can't stand this anymore. I'm gone. Goodbye. Which is not good for anybody.
No. That's something that I could literally spend this whole episode talking about, this particular issue. This is very personal for me. But I want to get back on the issue, the broader issue of males, the gender issues that we started talking about. One thing a term that came up that in my mind when I was preparing for this, the term toxic masculinity. That's what we hear a lot these days. So should men be defensive when they hear that term, or should they use it as an opportunity for self-examination or something else?
Well, self-examination is never a bad thing. I wish a lot of women would participate in it because, when you point a finger at somebody else, it's 3 fingers pointing back at you. Self-examination is never a bad thing. I think men have undergone a whole lot more self-examination over the past 60 years than women have. women have examined what they want that they don't have, but they haven't really examined, their privileges and their expectations and their feelings of entitlement and their belief that, because they don't have to compete so much in life and therefore are not involved in as much violence as men are involved in, they are therefore more peaceful. That kind of nonsense. So toxic masculinity is a phrase that originally came out of the social sciences to talk about the ways in which masculinity and traditional norms of masculinity could be toxic and detrimental to men themselves. And so it really didn't bother me that much when people first started talking about toxic masculinity. Because, if a man is raised to believe that he always has to be right and he always has to be in control, that's going to cause him problems. And so the idea that men are always having to be right and always having to be in control, that's a part of traditional masculinity, at least the way some men learn it. But more recently, toxic masculinity has been flipped to talk not about the fakeness of the masks that men are forced to wear, but toxic masculinity is now supposedly something that we enjoy, and it's really part of how men oppress women. To me, the idea of toxic masculinity in that sense is crazy, because imagine you live next to a lake that has been polluted. You would know not to eat the fish out of that lake, right? But would it make sense to talk about toxic fish, or would it make better sense to talk about toxic lakes? And so rather than talk about men as the ones who are exhibiting masculinity that's toxic, we really need to be talking about the system, the culture that produces all of these pollutants connected to men and dump them into the lives that we expect men to live. Yes, toxic masculinity does exist, but it doesn't start with men. That's my take on it.
Okay. So getting males from boyhood successfully to manhood seems to be a problem. A lot of people in our culture seem to be stuck in adolescence. Failure to launch is generally what it's called. So how does society get boys successfully into adulthood as fully functioning men rather than perpetual kids?
To incentivize them. It's a disincentive for boys to see that adult men are a mess, that adult men are not respected, adult men are disregarded, that nobody really cares about how men as a group are doing. And so they say, well, why should I work real hard so I can achieve that? Women don't respect me. They're making their own money. So even if I work real hard and make money, they don't really need me. I don't want to be valued just for how much money I make. I want to be loved and respected and cared for, and I want to be seen as a human being. Just like women are human beings. They have a full range of emotions that they can express. I, as a man, want to be able to express my sadness, my worries, my disappointments. But the expectations of men are that the only negative emotion we should express is anger, because it's so manly. It's embarrassing to see a man saying, I'm so sad. I'm so sad. I don't know what to do. I think I'm going to commit suicide. Now, it's not that simple, of course, but men commit suicide about 4 times as often as women do. Now, what's the explanation given for that? Well, a not very good one, if you ask me. It's very dismissive, very cold, very callous on the part of many women, especially the leaders of the women's movement, who get their money, their payrolls, by convincing the philanthropies that only women have problems. The explanation that these women give for why men commit suicide 4 times more often than women is because men have more access to guns. That's it. Now, that might be true, and maybe it's the whole truth. I doubt it. But what's really vexing about this is that that's the answer that is given, and that closes the discussion. I think there needs to be a whole lot more discussion. Why do men commit suicide 4 times more often than women when men supposedly have it all?
That's a wide-ranging topic that we do need to discuss further. By we, I mean society as a whole. And I'd like to have you back sometime to talk about that specific issue, if you're willing to do that.
Sure.
But
it's not just grown men. You were asking about young men. How do we get them to launch and pursue adult lives the way we want them to pursue adult lives? Young boys are seeing the differences between the way girls are treated, the way boys are treated, and they're thinking, I don't want this life. Boom. Or, jump off a bridge or hang themselves or, overdose.
Oh, that's certainly a tragic outcome for something that's generally emotional. And I want to talk, you talked about the range of women's emotions that are acceptable as opposed to men being allowed to express and experience a range of emotions. And I've understood that my whole life, basically. I didn't understand why or how, but I understand what. And one of the things that I learned growing up and that I've told my son, I have one biological son who's now 27 years old, and I have 2 stepsons who are 16-year-old twins, boys, and I've also raised 3 girls, so 3 of each. And one thing I've told the males in my family is that there's more than one way to be a man. You don't have to follow this direction to be a man. You don't have to go hunting every weekend. You don't have to go fishing. You don't have to do this or that. You can be creative. And one of the things that I experienced, I took a Myers-Briggs personality test when I was probably early 30s. And it told me I had the rarest personality profile in the world. And it made all the sense. It's just started making sense. My life started making sense to me. That I'm an introvert, I'm introspective, I'm intuitive, I'm nurturing, I'm creative. I've always been a writer, but I also played sports. I played baseball in college, so I didn't neatly fit into any real categories. And it took me until my 40s to be able to fully embrace that. And I didn't want my sons to have to go through that kind of situation. I wanted them to understand that if they like my biological son is a mechanical engineer and he played sports. He's much more traditional type that you might expect a man to be. But there were times when he liked art. He likes to cook. He got married last summer and he does most of the cooking in his family. That's what I want him to understand, that don't accept anybody else's expectations for you. That's manhood for you. You don't need to explain it. You don't need to apologize for it. That's what it is.
Perfect. The way I sometimes say it is, a real man is a man who doesn't care about anybody else's definition of a real man.
That makes perfect sense to me.
Yep. I'm just who I am, and I'm a man. So I'm not a fake man. I'm not a pretend man. I'm a real man. I'm a real man. And I do this and I don't do that. So deal.
Right. And sometimes it takes a while to understand that when you're trying to fit into roles.
And I think a lot of bullying that boys do among themselves, or between the bully and the quote unquote oddball, is sort of like it comes out of the same emotion as why we like to go to horror films and why we like to watch wrestling matches, WrestleMania. We don't really like what we're doing, but we also don't like the fact that this kid that I'm picking on is so different. And he's so not what I am told and feeling like I need to be, which is a tough guy. So, you take a bazillion different people, a bazillion different men. There are a bazillion different ways to be a great man. And that's just the way we gotta back each other up and not give each other a hard time for, failing to meet the culture's expectations, which primarily are making money. A subcategory is, competing, always wanting to compete and win 24/7, 365. A lot of competitive men really enjoy being competitive, but I don't know any man that wants to always compete 24/7, 365. Too much of any good thing is a bad thing.
I'm probably the most competitive person I know, and I don't want to compete all the time. But when I compete, I like to win. But I want the competition to be equal. I want the other person to have the same opportunity to win, but I want to win. And so because the win would be worthless if all the odds were stacked in my favor, and the other person didn't have the equal opportunity to win.
Well, I read your daughter's interview of you, and I remember that you said about the American Legion system of baseball teams. Mm-hmm. You had to earn it. You didn't just get it. It's not a participation trophy. You really had to earn it. And what is competition other than an opportunity for you to sort of see how good you are? And there ain't nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with wanting to feel good about how good you are. Yeah. I do want to mention an old joke from the beginning days of the men's movement. Two sensitive New Age guys are arguing, well, I'm less competitive than you are. No, I'm less competitive than you are. They're competing about who's less competitive because
that's funny.
Being competitive suddenly became a bad thing.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
All right. So you touched on this earlier when you talked about the so-called wimp bill with Elijah Cummings, but I've lived this personally. But I want to know what you mean when you talk about the double whammy that black men have to deal with.
Well, I like to talk about the double whammy for two reasons. One is that it's the right thing to do, because I don't think you might not know this, but I was a parole and probation agent in central Baltimore for a year. I was a jail guard at the Baltimore City Jail for a year. And I did that after social work school. And I went to social work school because I saw in my majority black city of Baltimore that, what I thought was true was true, that black men were not getting into trouble only because of racism, but also because of sexism. You're no good because you're black, and you're no good because you're male. Boom. Black men get knocked down by racism. Sexism comes along to kick them, is the way I have written it. And so, to me, it's pretty clear that there are really no advantages in America of being black. And it's getting to be a little more equal, but there certainly haven't been any traditional advantages of being black. There have been traditional advantages of being male, but there have also been tons of disadvantages of being male in the ways we talked about earlier. And so it just sort of seems clear to me that black men have a double burden of isms operating against them. And so the first reason I like to talk about the double whammy is because it's the right thing. The second reason is because it helps strategically to get people to at least entertain the idea that there might be something about being male that is problematic. If the only problem for black men was that they were black and dealing with racism, black women would be having the same level of problems. But by a large number of very important measures, black women are doing significantly better, generally speaking, than black men are. If the only problem were racism, that couldn't happen. That wouldn't be, because both men and women who are black suffer the same racism. There's the added ingredient of, well, you're a woman, so therefore you're a better black person. You're a man, so you're a worser black person. That's what I mean by the double whammy, and that's why I think it's important to talk about.
All right. So, as a white man talking about this type of an issue, have you gotten more skepticism, more resistance from women or men, black or white?
If you can have an honest conversation with a man who doesn't have a lot of people around, just one-on-one, every man says, yeah, I know that's right. It's very clear. I mean, men know the pressures that they operate under. They sometimes wonder why they ever got married. I didn't get married until I was 60. And up until I was married, I used to hear men say to me quite frequently, how did you ever avoid it, man? How did you ever avoid it? I'm happily married now, but I didn't have to raise kids and have all of that pressure of being, rising through a career to raise kids. So I just, maybe I should mention this. My grandfather had a drugstore in downtown Baltimore. Opened it in 1912. He died in 1965. In the interim, during the life of that store, the neighborhood went from Irish and Polish to black. And we used to go down to my grandfather's drugstore and quote unquote work when really all we did was to make sundaes for ourselves because he had a soda fountain and, eat all the candy. But I remember these black men coming in. They had the pomade, they had the do-rag. And they were as nice as they could be to us. They were just as nice as they could be. And the women too. And when I would go back to, my white neighborhood after visiting my grandparents, and, I would talk about these guys. Well, weren't you afraid of them? No, they were nice. They were nice to us. So I think maybe I have a lot of empathy for what these guys are trying to do. And I certainly developed more empathy for these guys when I was a parole and probation agent in central Baltimore. Almost all of my clients were black.
Actually, that's what I wanted to talk about next. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
No. Go ahead. What angle do you want to talk about?
I worked in Baltimore City, and I was a media relations director for the Housing Authority during the time I was there. I started in 2002. And so I got to see some of the best and the worst of the city. And so I'm wondering what being a probation officer and being working in the Baltimore jail was like for you.
Man, the jail was rough. And I wasn't even in the worst part of the jail. But I'll tell you, one thing that's true is that a jail cannot run without the cooperation of the inmates. I don't know if you've ever heard that, and I don't know if it's a saying, but it was pretty clear to me that, a riot could have happened at any time, and they could have taken over at least for a day or two if they wanted to. But being a jail guard, correctional officer, I didn't get a lot of chance to really have much conversation with the fellas, but I could sort of observe them. And having just gotten out of social work school and not really being able to find the kind of job working with men that I wanted to, I at least sort of sat back and observed what was going on with these guys. And I asked a couple of them, did you ever wonder why it's men who are in jail and not women? And they had never thought of that before. And I tried to explain a little bit about, what might be going on and, why they did what they did and where the pressures to do that came from. But when I was a parole and probation agent, I would have, much more time, which is not to say I had a lot of time. The caseloads are crazy. And, I could maybe spend 10 minutes with each of my clients once a month. But I was regarded as a pretty nice probation officer, that I really was trying to help these guys. And the word sort of got around, the waiting room that, Mr. Kammer was a pretty good guy. Now, no doubt that meant some of my guys were playing me. I understand that. They were playing me and playing on my wishes to try to help them and not to drop the hammer on them. But some of these guys, unless they deserve the Academy Award, they were really, truly, truly distraught. I mean, I had some guys who had done some really bad things, and they were crying in my office about the fact that they just could not catch a break. They want to be back home with their kids. They don't have a job. They don't have any money. Other fellows were telling me about how they were being accused of domestic violence, not because they were not good fathers, but in some cases, and in these cases of fellas I knew and believed and trusted, because they were too good, and they made the mother look bad. And if social services found out that he was a better father, he might get the kids and get the check. And then where would she be? There's a lot of heart and soul in what Black men have endured over the centuries, right? It's called soul music for a reason. And I developed a lot of empathy for their struggle. And I don't like that it's ignored. And I didn't like the way the recent election unfolded. Because I didn't hear Kamala Harris say, yeah, I really get what's going on with Black men. Late in the campaign, when she knew she was in trouble, she came up with this idea of trying to help Black entrepreneurs. But that was pretty transparently bogus. There was no real interest in really helping Black men. And I think that's because one of the places where Black men most need help puts men into close proximity, sometimes with a contentious issue at hand, with a woman. Because, again, what men most want and need is to be recognized as kind, caring, loving, nurturing, patient, gentle people. And if I want an opportunity to show that to these kids that you and I have together, a lot of women think that that's a challenge. That means the kids will love her less. It's zero-sum thinking, but it exists. So talking about the double whammy puts on the table the idea that there is such a thing as sexism against men that causes or contributes to social problems. And then you can transfer that to white men as well, or to all men as well. And so, it's an important thing to talk about.
It's a very important thing to talk about. And I think on that note, I think that we'll wind up this episode. And so Jack Kammer has been and that's, again, if you missed the very beginning, that is his real name, Jack Kammer, former social worker in Maryland. Thank you so much for being on the show today and talking about this issue. I'd like to have you back to continue this conversation, if you don't mind.
Would love to.
All right, that sounds great. So if you're not already following me on Spotify or some other podcast platform, please do so right now before you forget. And don't lie to yourself and say you'll remember to do it later. You're not going to remember. Trust me, you're going to forget, because I forget things all the time. Do it now while it's on your mind. And I would appreciate it if you'd share this episode with a friend. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other's stories and journeys. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.